Hi. Hello? Can't hear anything.
Hey, David. I can only see half your face.
Yes, I'll fix that.
There you go.
Yes, how are you?
Like everybody else,
Yeah, right.
confined.
Okay.
I know, to tell you the truth, I hate to go in with a picture because I can't stand to see myself.
You look fine. Take it easy.
It's still disconcerting.
All of us need a haircut. But
Yes,
how are the Wrights, by the way?
they're great. You know, Josie had an accident. She broke her. She's amazing. She was in the hospital, but she made a great recovery and she's fine.
Wow.
And the two of them are absolutely isolated. They are not in contact with anybody except this way.
Are they at Horsehead now?
No.
Okay. Yeah. Good
No,
evening,
they're
James.
not at Horsehead anymore.
Oh, they've given it up.
Yes, they share it with their children. They have a couple of weeks where they are there.
Okay. Yeah. Well, that had to happen.
By the way, David, I don't need a haircut because I went to the barber
Yeah.
2 weeks ago, I think now, when Georgia opened up. I mean, it was a pretty small opening, although a big deal was made of it. But I went to both the dentist and the barber on the same day, and so far I'm a survivor.
Well, as I mentioned on Facebook, I was stunned because for years I've been getting my hair cut by a particular woman at a hair cuttery that is only about 100 yards away from my house. And naturally they've been shut down. But now they have a sign on the door that they will not be opening. They're closed forever. So,
Yeah, it's sad.
yeah, that's right.
And of course,
really?
it ends up being sort of the survival of the biggest,
Yes.
which is not what our economy needs, in my opinion.
No.
So when I went to the barber, you had to make an appointment, so they limited the number of people in the shop. The chairs were 6 feet apart, and the barber had a mask on, and the clippers went under a UV light, and I didn't go to my face until I'd been to the hand sanitizer back in my car. So I felt like the vector was pretty weak to get me, even if the barber was totally contagious. So,
Well, I hope so. Yeah.
yeah. And I'm beyond the 14 days now. So, you know.
So I can pause the recording. Make sure you remind me to start it again.
Oh, you mean you're recording all this now?
Ugh.
It records automatically, but wait a second. Now, like last time, I'm going to try to combine the macro level, if you will, of the great history that was going on at the height of this last crisis with the micro level, which we're going to look at from several different points of view. Not only from Mr. Roberts, but a couple of other things that I have prepared as well that we'll get to in due time. Now,
David, could you mute us? David, could you mute us? Because I'm hearing a lot of background.
I'm afraid I may be responsible for some of that, and I can turn it off.
We can all mute ourselves.
You can mute yourselves, yes. I would just assume you didn't, but that's okay. If it's necessary, then we'll do it. Okay, so make sure you raise your hand and wait for me to see you. That's it. Okay, now to begin with, let me just say that one of the things that you discover when you've read this stuff and you've really absorbed it, and then you go back to the history you've always known, is that could be. A lot of people have recognized some of the generational insights and also some of the insights about different eras. And one of them, as a matter of fact, turns out to have been Franklin Roosevelt, who did have a real sense of the 80-year cycle. And to prove that, I'm going to let you listen to just about the first minute of his third inaugural address in January of 1941, when he was already cranking us up for possible participation in the war. So here's the opening of that address. Hold it. Yeah. Oh. Oh. Did everybody hear that okay? You did not hear that. I beg your pardon. All right, I know why. I'll fix it. Wait. Oh.
Are you trying to share the screen, Dave? Is that what you're doing?
You're not hearing it?
No.
Oh, sorry.
You'll have to share the screen.
I
And
did share the screen, but it's a little more complicated than that. Hang on. We will get there. Wait. All right. Now. Okay. Here we go. Okay. Wait a second.
Now you're cooking.
Right.
Somehow the volume's not coming through. I'm not hearing.
We see your screen, but we don't hear it.
Oh, no. Well, oh, wait. We solved this last time, so we can solve it again. I think, all right, there's one other thing I can do. Okay, sorry. Now, I just have to, okay. Uh, oh, yes, 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 yes. I remember now. Here we go. Here we go.
Mr. Chief Justice, my friends, on each National Day of Inauguration since 1789, the people have renewed their sense of dedication to the United States. In Washington's day, the task of the people was to create and weld together a nation. In Lincoln's day, the task of the people was to preserve that nation from disruption from within. In this day, the task of the people is to save that nation and its institutions from disruption from without.
Okay, everybody got that? So, you see, in 3 sentences, he links the current crisis to the 2 earlier ones. Now, I want to make the point, because we'll see how it links the 2 levels really, that Roosevelt, even by this time, was making it very clear that he saw the World War as a struggle between different political systems, different ways of life, and a struggle to preserve and extend freedom as we understood it, and a war for democracy. At the same time, I want to run through a very quick summary of what I found in No End Save Victory, my book about 1940 and 41, to bring out some of the most interesting things, I think, about how he handled the crisis and how his men handled the crisis. Roosevelt clearly, since at least 1936 or 37, had seen a possible world war coming. And he had tried to warn the country about it. He hadn't gotten very far. There was a great deal of isolation sentiment. They hadn't done too much about preparing. Even after the war broke out in Europe, it was very hard to get Congress to agree to allow the country even to sell arms to Britain and France, for cash, no less, although we did manage that. But the big turning point, comparable, if you will, to the emergence of the COVID virus in our time, was the fall of Denmark and Norway and then France in the spring of 1940, which everyone agreed put the Western Hemisphere and the United States at risk. That was for several reasons. First of all, a lot of people thought that Britain was going to fall very quickly as well, or that the British would make peace. Indeed, the fear that the British would fall at some point extended at least well into 1941. and there was no real confidence in Washington that they were going to last. All the European nations that had been conquered had possessions in the Western Hemisphere. Hitler could try to move into them. Also, the ability to use sea and air power to to use air power in particular, for the Germans to take Norway showed that they could leapfrog over oceans. There was a lot of talk about how they could go to Iceland, then to Greenland, then a relatively short hop to Labrador and establish themselves in the Western Hemisphere. So there was general agreement that we needed a lot of preparation. And the most dramatic step that was taken in the summer of 1940 was a law to double the size of the Navy in the next 5 or 6 years, what was called the Two Ocean Navy, and it was passed with very little debate and very little opposition in the Congress. In other words, while still many people were opposed to getting into the war in Europe, they accepted that a German victory and the possibility of Japanese expansion in the Far East made this a very dangerous world and we had to get ready for it. That wasn't all. Everybody thought air power was going to be key in this war. FDR, in the speech in late May of 1940, called for the production of 50,000 aircraft. This is when we only had a few thousand. That was a stunning proposal, but within a couple of years we would actually do that. Let me pause a moment to welcome John Stark, a new member who has just signed in with us. And I'm talking in general about what Roosevelt and his administration were doing in 1940. So now, the question was what we were preparing for, and we didn't know. Now, in fact, another big step in the summer of 1940 was the destroyer deal with Britain, when Roosevelt, answering Churchill's desperate pleas for help at sea, gave the British 50 older destroyers in exchange for base rights in British possessions running from Newfoundland, which was not part of Canada at that moment, by the way. It was still a British colony, through the Atlantic in Bermuda, and then in the Caribbean. And that was not just a meaningless gesture to persuade the American people that they were getting something in return for their help at all. It was a way to extend our defense perimeter out into the Atlantic in the event that Britain did fall and we had to meet a German threat directly. And in fact, we went to work building up bases there right away. And that was also going to lead in 1941 to putting American troops in Iceland, but I won't get into that. Now, meanwhile, though, there were a couple of key developments in the fall of 1940. One public, one secret in the early fall. One was that Germany, Japan, and Italy signed the Tripartite Pact, which was basically, almost in these words, a pledge that if the United States got into war, either in Europe or in Asia, they would all go to war with the United States. So it was not going to be a one-front war. Meanwhile, we had broken the Japanese diplomatic code with the magic intercepts, and it became more and more clear during 1940 and 41 that both sides were very serious about this, the Japanese in particular, and that we weren't going to be able to get them to stay out of the war if we went to war with Germany, which is where we saw the bigger threat. The second thing, though, was a long memorandum that the heads of the Army and Navy gave to FDR about our preparedness, and particularly with respect to ammunition. And what it said is, we're very short of ammunition. We now have the money to ramp up production somewhat, but it's going to be 2 years, that is to say, until the second half of 1942, before we will have enough ammunition to undertake any major combat operations. So Roosevelt, under the circumstances, couldn't be in a hurry to get into the war that we weren't going to be ready to fight. And the planning at this point was all based on the defense of the Western Hemisphere, not on fighting overseas. And they envisioned, for instance, a maximum army of 4 million men, which would take some time. They had this huge new Navy planned now and authorized, but it was going to be years before it was ready. Now, Roosevelt also started some new agencies, actually there were a series of them, he kept renaming them, to ramp up production. And they used the techniques they'd used in the New Deal to build dams and lots of other things. And he had a leading industry representative and leading labor representative to head what became the Office of Production Management. Those were William Knudsen, who had been the chairman of the board of GM, and Sidney Hillman, who was a garment workers leader and very prominent. Well, and they worked together, and they brought a lot of industry people to Washington to help plan. And meanwhile, labor was making gains, new plants were opening up. All this was going together. Now, in the spring of, I'm sorry, in the late winter, right after he was, well, even before he was inaugurated, he had made his next big proposal, which was Lend-Lease, which would allow him to give an unlimited amount of military equipment to the British. It was going to take a long time to get things to the British, though, in sufficient quantity. It's clear that they didn't think Lend-Lease would necessarily allow the British to get through 1941. It was another excuse to ramp up production. Some of the leading figures in the administration in the spring of 1941 wanted to get into the war right away. The British were doing badly. They were getting the crap beaten out of them in the Mediterranean. There was a lot of fear of what would come next. But FDR clearly didn't want to do that, partly again because we weren't ready to fight. Now, the big turning point I discovered, I'm sorry, meanwhile also, though, that's right, Roosevelt was laying out war aims in the State of the Union address and in other addresses. And he defined the aims as the four freedoms, which some of the older people may remember from our childhood when they were still talked about a lot. Freedom of speech, freedom of religion, freedom from want, freedom from fear. This is what the US was fighting for all over, not only for us, but to the extent that we could, all over the world, he said. Now, the huge turning point came in June with the German attack on the Soviet Union. Roosevelt expressed some optimism right off the bat, which few people did, that the Soviets would be able to survive the attack. And he realized that if they did, this opened up a whole new range of possibilities for the war that we could certainly think about not only going beyond the defense of the Western Hemisphere and actually defeating the Germans, and if need be, the Japanese as well. And he asked Henry Stimson, a leading Republican who he had made Secretary of War back in 1940. And the Secretary of War was the leading figure then. There wasn't any Defense Department yet. In early July, just a couple of weeks after the Soviet attack, I want you to draw up a program for meeting the requirements of what it would take to achieve the total defeat of our enemies, of all our possible enemies. And Stimson got to work on that, and they got to work on that in the War Department right away. The Air Force jumped on this with both feet. The Air Force wasn't even an independent service yet. It was part of the Army, but the leaders of the Air Force already had the idea, which dominated the Air Force for a long time, that air power would be able to win any war all by itself, mainly by bombing. So they began laying down very large requirements for aircraft of all kinds, but particularly bombers, which became part of the program. And meanwhile, we were trying to negotiate with the Japanese over the war they were fighting in China, but it became clear from Magic Intercepts, too, right again after the attack on the Soviet Union, that the Japanese were planning further moves. And in addition, as I say, there were numerous indications that the Japanese were going to go to war for German state. Meanwhile, the Navy got a role in the Atlantic in the second half of 1941 for patrolling against German ships in the western half of the Atlantic. Again, this was defended as a defensive measure to keep their ships away from the US, but it freed up some British naval capacity and thus was in a sense an offensive measure as well. Now, there was a lot of planning going on in Washington, economists thinking about what we could, how am I doing? Raise your hand if you can hear me okay. Can you hear me okay? Good, okay.
David, you keep cutting out, David.
I'm sorry, I don't know what I can do, but I'll do
And-
my best. I
Well-
will
Closer
invest
to
in
your
a,
router.
I will invest it, yes, it may well be, which is bad because I was gonna say I invested in a microphone, but I may be able to hook up to the router and that might be worth it. Okay. Not just wireless. I mean.
And the video is freezing.
Oh, okay, well, I hope it, I hope it does.
This is hopeless.
Well, let's hope for the best because last week it was okay. And I'm almost done here. Now, they couldn't, you think so, Chad? Well, let's see what happens in the next few minutes and let's see what happens when we go to some videos. And I hope that will not be necessary because that will be disruptive. But, okay. Now, I do want to, in the midst of this, the Japanese have decided to attack both the US and the British. Possibly, yes, somebody is. James, the answer is yes. And I don't think I could stop that either. Hold on, I'll see about that. How are we doing now? How are we doing now? Okay, should be okay. All right, the story I want to tell you is a tribute to the planning that they were doing. The Victory program was complete by about September, and it called for drafting 10 million men, which was thought to be more or less the maximum possibility, all the munitions for them, all the enormous industrial capacity that went along with that, et cetera. And the original directive in the Victory program had asked it to be prepared on the assumption that everything could be ready by July 1st, 1943. Now, Roosevelt saw it and approved it in principle, but this was something that they couldn't begin until they were actually in the war. There was no way they could go to the Congress for the money before that. And then on the eve of the war, the whole thing leaked in the Chicago Tribune, an anti-administration paper, who tried to raise a stink about it, but that was the week of Pearl Harbor, and then came Pearl Harbor. And then, 2 days after Pearl Harbor, there was a big meeting of the production group. And Stimson, as he put in his diary, went over to William Knudsen, the GM man who was head of production, and said, well, how about it? Can we reach the Victory program targets by July 1st, 1943? And Knudsen replied, no, we can't. But we can meet them by July 1st, 1944. In other words, he predicted, in effect, the moment when the big decisive offensives would begin, both in Europe and the Pacific. We were almost defenseless at that moment. We were terribly worried that Hawaii might be invaded, that the West Coast might be bombed. The Germans were about to have a field day in the Atlantic. It was going to be quite a while before we could take the offensive anywhere. But they were prepared enough, and that was what the United States was at that point, that they could do that. And that was the leadership they had, that they could be prepared enough. And this got going, the enormous production effort, whose effects we are now going to look at directly with some video. But before I do that, does anybody have any particular questions about the story I've just told? Partly, I admit, and I blogged about this recently, as a contrast to the response to the significant but certainly much smaller challenge of the epidemic that we face right now. So, any questions or comments on that before we move forward? Yes, James.
Yeah, so my dad was working for Alcoa
Oh, yeah.
and had gone to Georgia Tech and went through Navy ROTC. He was a metallurgist at Alcoa, and at some point in 1941, he was offered a job back in the Navy. His boss told him, well, you're in an essential industry, so if you don't want to go, you don't have to. Well, he went anyway, and he was actually in San Francisco on Pearl Harbor Day. So what I've always wondered was, what was the imperative? I'm going to guess it was the spring of 41 when he made that decision before Pearl Harbor. So what was the imperative for someone who had the potential to be a naval officer in the spring of 41, that you would start things in motion so that you were already, assigned to a ship by Pearl Harbor Day? It seems like all that stuff would have happened after Pearl Harbor, not before.
Well, I think that there were a lot of people who saw it coming, and we're just glad to get into it. I mean, we would have to ask your father, which unfortunately we can't. But it sounds like perhaps he had a little bit of the spirit of Mr. Roberts as well, which we will get to in detail later. I can't remember when John F. Kennedy got into the Navy. I do know he had to lie about his medical condition to do so, and I think it might have been before Pearl Harbor, but I'm honestly not sure. Chaz, you read something? Yeah.
Yeah, my grandfather, a 1905 cohort, was similar to James's father's position, only he was a little bit earlier. And the reason I got, or at least he gave my mother, was that he had always wanted to be in the Navy, and that they were ramping things up, and he'd been wanting to be in the armed service at some point in the Navy, needed radio men. So he went and was a radio man. He got, however, didn't serve in the war. He's actually got shipped out in September 1941. He had been on the Arizona, actually.
Oh my God.
By the time he got back from Hawaii, the war had started.
Also, yeah. Anything else? Yes, Janie?
Well,
Janie,
Okay.
you're muted.
Yes. So if we are sharing GI generation experiences, my father ended up being stationed in Hawthorne, Nevada, where they were manufacturing the ammunition for the Pacific, and they were burying all the bombs in the sand there at Hawthorne. But so he was in the Navy, and he was in charge of this huge ramp up in munitions in the middle of the desert in Nevada, and they were shipping it out like crazy. So when you talk about the buildup, they were it was a huge undertaking in the desert in Nevada. So anyway, that was cool.
Okay. Yes, Judy. You have to unmute.
Well, I just looked up Kennedy, and he joined the U.S. Naval Reserves in 1940.
I think Michael Levitin also just informed us that he was actually active by the end of 1941. So, yeah.
well, another part of the story was the emphasis, at least in my dad's case, on the Pacific. that it was not just the Germans and the English or
Yeah.
whatever that was the concern, that the Japanese must have been pretty high up on the radar by that point.
Yes, I think that's true. And most of the Navy was in the Pacific at that point.
Especially when you consider the fact that the Philippines were still at that point under U.S. control.
Yes, oh yes, and that's right. And MacArthur is going out to defend the Philippines. In fact, though, this is another thing I found, and then we probably should get going further. The war nearly broke out in the Atlantic. In November, you remember the Bismarck, which went into the Atlantic and was sunk by the British in the late spring of '41. And another German cruiser, the Scheer, they were sending it in the Atlantic on a raid. And we knew it, and American ships were going out to meet it. And that would have set the war off, but it turned back. It had some sort of trouble and turned back. And but for that, I think it would have begun then, and then the Japanese would have come in. Okay, well now we're going to look at the build-up firsthand with the help of a wonderful documentary that some of you may have seen, The Life and Times of Rosie the Riveter, about women in the war effort. Has anybody seen that documentary? Wow. All right. Well, I'm almost sad I didn't use it, although, and it is available to stream for just a few bucks, and I'm going to post the link. It was interviews with 5 different women who had been war workers. It was done in 1980 or 81. I saw it when it came out, and I must say I was a little stunned as I watched it again today and lifted a couple of clips to think that the distance from the time I first saw the movie until now is just as long as the distance from the beginning of the war to the time that I saw the movie. And it's very moving to me to watch these movies now when we know that nobody involved in them is here anymore. So I have one clip just to give an introduction. And the wonderful thing about this film is that it intersperses the interviews with these women done in the late 70s or early 80s with a lot of propaganda film that was done about them at the time. And they're sort of complementary, although the propaganda sugarcoats a lot of things. So let's see if we can do this smoothly now.
War. More and more men are being called into the armed forces. Their jobs must be filled.
Are
And
we
filled
okay?
now. And who can fill them? You women. You're the ones who,
No video.
who can give our boys
Hold
what they
it.
need.
I can hear it, but I cannot see the video.
All right, I know what happened. I'm sorry. It's very hard to get the sequencing right. Yeah. Oh. Oh. Okay. Ah, yes. Okay.
If you need training, you can get it, and it's free. We must win this war. But we can't win this war unless you women take over the jobs that men are leaving. And you're needed right now.
I said, come on, we can go and get in the shipyards. And so when I tried to get into the shipyards, they told me I had to go to school. And then I found out about Samuel Gompers, and I went to Samuel Gompers and took training for ship fitter.
Men had been telling us all along the line that, oh, it takes 6 years to become a welder. You've got to be an apprentice, you've got to be this. They had been sold a bill of goods in their lives. You see, it wasn't true at all. It just worked out for bosses to do that. Actually, it could be learned and learned well if it was taught well in a short period of time.
He told me I'd passed 98%. He said, you've got good grades, you passed 98%. Do you know anything that a person's really interested in, why they make better grades at it than something they don't like to do?
In the sprawling aircraft factories on the West Coast, teams of women flush the rivets that hold together the aluminum skin on the wing of a B-24. This is like punching holes in a tin of scouring powder. Instead of cutting out dresses, this woman stamps out the patterns of airplane parts. They are taking to welding as though the welding rod were a needle and the metal a length of cloth to be sewn. After a short apprenticeship, a woman can operate this press as easily as a juice extractor in her own kitchen. And a lathe will hold no more terrors for her than an electric washing machine.
Everybody is seeing it?
No.
And it wasn't any time before we got the knack of it. Because for one thing, women's hands weren't as big and clumsy as men. We had to grind our own tools. So therefore, it was easier for us to know when to stop grinding, how to take the machine loose. We had I don't know, more of a subtle touch with it. Really, I mean, we did better than the men.
They didn't do anything to make it easy for you, unless maybe you'd run into one that was stuck on you and wanted to date you or something like that, and then he'd go out of his way for a little while. If it didn't work out, well, you can get no help from him either.
The men, you know, had the, sometimes they treated us pretty badly because to a man, when a woman walked in, it meant that a man went to war. And even though the population was very much in favor of the war, on an individual basis, who the hell wants to go to war?
As our armed forces grew, so did their demands for equipment, supplies, food, material of all kinds. The need for women grew desperate, and thousands of women answered the call.
How's that?
The Hidden Army drew fresh recruits. Its ranks grew to nearly 18 million. Many of these women came from walks of life not previously considered. The mothers, the young, the aged. When they were asked why they had joined the ranks of the Hidden Army, these women gave a variety of reasons.
My husband's a prisoner of the Japs in the Philippines. If he'd had a few more of these shells out in Bataan, maybe he'd still be fighting.
I'm an old maid, and I didn't have anyone until I took this defense job. Now, I have a family of 10 million to look after.
Why did I take a defense job? That's a funny question. I never thought of that before. Do you have to have a reason? We're in a jam, aren't we? I'm sorry, but you'll have to excuse me. I'm too busy to answer damn fool questions like that.
Somehow that answer pleased us. No sudden emotional urge sent this young woman into war work. No loss of a loved one. No temporary economic embarrassment. No mere yearning for excitement or novelty. There are millions like her. There will have to be.
I knew I was a riveter, because with all this training, and I really said, this is really going to be nice. But when they sent me in there, they sent me to the foundry.
Okay. Did we get the video there for the latter part?
Yeah.
Okay, good. I'm sorry for the mess, but I think we've got it straightened out now, and we have another clip coming. Any particular comments on what you saw and heard, especially heard?
I guess I was just sort of amused at the discussions of the kinds of jobs that the women were doing in relation to what they did in the home. You know, it's a reflection of the time, but it's just funny, you know, that to hear the women, you know, being described as, oh, gee, they really can handle a welder, welding tool.
Right. I agree. It's patronizing.
Yeah, very.
Yes, huge.
I once read that in the early days of the war, more women died in munitions factories than men died in action.
Actually, I'm not sure you're going to see it in the clip I have, but there is a headline about that from, I think, early 1944, although it isn't specifically about women. It's about that the number of workers who have died in accidents at that moment is higher than the number of men who've been killed in battle. Or maybe it's 1943, but that did come up. Yes. Yeah, Susan.
I actually have a question. This may sound on the stupid side, actually, but you know, I guess I was struck by the response of the woman who said, "Why am I doing this?" I mean, it was basically, she was saying that's kind of a dumb question. I don't have the time. I don't have the time to even answer it. But I am curious. I mean, now that I think about it, to know why women did go to work. What was motivating them, in a very broad way. I don't mean, you know, to get more money, but surely that was one factor. They didn't have a breadwinner if their husbands were off, you know, in the war. The men of the family were often off fighting the war. So can we? I'd just like to hear a little bit about what actually was happening that was attracting women to come into the factories.
Well, let me give a multi-part answer. First of all, did you see that woman who you were talking about? You couldn't see her.
I could see her, yeah.
Okay. That is one of the ones who I would bet a lot of money was an actress.
Yes, she was beautiful. She was,
yes, that's right.
Perfect. Yes,
that's right. And it wasn't terribly convincing, but that is what the women talk about. And the number one reason was money. And many of them, one of them had been working on a farm that I think she lost. And a couple, there are 5 women, 3 of them are black, 2 of them are white. And a couple of women, of the black women, had been doing housework. And this was a big step up economically for them.
Yeah.
So that was the huge part of it. But they all, and well, you'll see this in the next clip too. They all really enjoyed the camaraderie and the feeling of accomplishment and the feeling that they were part of something as well. Now, the thing that really hit me as I was watching much more of the movie is that, like the men in the military, a lot of them were gotten into it partly because this was just what everybody was doing and this is what you were supposed to do.
Yeah.
And that, now no generation is completely free of that, but that is so characteristic of the GI generation.
Yeah.
And their attitude towards everything. And that is why, and this comes up at the end of the movie too. Well, I didn't clip this. I could clip it next time, and maybe I will. When the war was over, they uniformly accepted the new propaganda line was that now it's time to get back into the house and have kids and let your men go back to work. And they did, although some of them 40 years later feel a lot of regret about that. Okay, let me go ahead with the next one, and I hope that this time I'll be able to do it smoothly. Oh, wait. No, wait. I went a little too quickly there. Just hang on a second. Okay.
when we finished one of these beautiful ships, and I remember them, 2 of them went down the way without me. One of them I rode down with it. It was an inspiring, thrilling thing. Here is something you have done, you've worked on, and once it went down into the water and withstood the test of staying afloat, I don't know how to describe it. It's a thrill. Your whole body is thrilled from it because you've done something that's worthwhile.
One night, close to Christmas, we were really cold in spite of working with the torches because the wind was blowing through the broken windows. We put stuffed rags into the holes, but it was no good. My coworker, who was a black man from the South, and I were doing our usual trip around the farm case, welding the sides. And this particular night, I think I was feeling a little low altogether. The war was taking a long, long time, and the men were away, not for a year or 2, but for the duration, which might mean forever. And it was beginning to wear on me. And my partner, as he passed by, he raised up his goggles, and he really smiled into my face, and he said to me in Yiddish, "Arbeit macht das Leben süß." And I looked at him. And it was the sweetest thing he could have said to me at that moment. Work makes life sweet.
Edith Stoner's husband is in Alaska.
Okay, that's it. So there we saw that. Now there is also quite a bit of discussion in the movie about unions. And actually the second woman we saw there, the Brooklynite, talks about the organizing experience they had and how unhappy the boss was at first, but they accepted it. And in the same way, the black women talk about running into racism a number of times, but in general, the bosses and the foremen and the co-workers had to accept them, although at the beginning some of them didn't, because they had to get the job done. And in fact, that to me was the great thing about, one of the great things about getting the whole country mobilized on behalf of this great crusade is, which also involved a lot of mobilization and distribution of resources, was everybody wanted to get into it. And for instance, the army was segregated. There was a big question as to whether, at the beginning, starting in 1940, when they put the draft in, would black soldiers be able to be in combat? Would they be in specialized branches? And the government did commit to creating black units of all kinds, although they would not integrate. That didn't come to after the war. But the black soldiers ran into some interesting situations too. And I want to read an excerpt from this wonderful book, The Good War, by Studs Terkel, of reminiscences about the war from all sorts of people. And this is from a black man who signed up to train as a tanker and was very proud to do so. He was part of a separate black tank unit. And the whole idea of black tank units was very controversial. And he claims, although I tried to verify this, that General Patton, a leading tank commander in Europe, had been quoted to the effect that Negroes could not be tankers, could not run tanks, that they could never master the equipment. But they were training, and as he says, we went to Fort Hood, Texas early in '44. We trained against the tank destroyer outfits and consistently made monkeys out of it. They had both white and black. We established quite a reputation. In '44, General Patton requested the best separate battalion they had left in the United States. He wanted them for the 3rd Army. We weren't in a division. Patton had made a statement that Negroes were incapable of being tankers. The equipment was too technical. And who should General Patton see when he went into the armored field? Us. Here we come, the best they had left in the United States. He viewed us for quite some time. Finally, he said, "You're the first Negro tankers ever to be used in the American Army and in combat. I want you to establish a record for yourselves and a record for your race. I want you to make a liar out of me. When you get in combat, and you will be in combat, when you see those Kraut sons of bitches, don't spare the ammunition. Of course, the Negroes whooped because here was a white man telling the Negroes to shoot white people. Well, that really tore us up. And he says later that he was very appreciative of the treatment that he got from Patton. Now, Patton was from the lost generation, like most of the great commanders of that war, and a nomad. Do you see anything particularly nomadic about that way of handling that situation?
Whatever gets the job done.
Exactly. Right. The only question is, are these guys going to help me or not? And if they can, great. Yes. Okay. Which leads us, right. Oh no, before we go to Mr. Roberts, I have one more thing, having to do again with the idealism and the goals of the war. And this is quite an interesting scene. And again, sometimes I find something that I feel like if I had ordered it up, I couldn't have done any better than what I found. This is from a propaganda film that was made by John Ford, I think in 1942, called December 7th. And it's about Pearl Harbor, it's about Hawaii, it's about the Japanese minorities, it's about all sorts of things. But it ends with this dramatic recreation in Arlington Cemetery with the help of another GI actor, Dana Andrews. So let's see how effectively I can do this. Do you see it?
So that's the story of Pearl Harbor.
You see it?
Before, during, and after.
Coming.
Good. Oh, sorry, we got an ad again.
Not yet.
We have an ad.
The infamous attack on December 7th. It's all true. You can take my word for it because I know. I was there. I died there.
Who are you parley-vooing with, buddy?
Oh, just talking to some of our fellow Americans.
Up here or down there?
Down there.
It's a waste of time.
Oh, they're all right.
That ain't the way I size them up. I ought to know. I've been watching them from up here for 24 years.
Where did you get yours?
On the Marne.
Oh, you're a veteran.
To you rookies, yeah, but I ain't no veteran. Over there's men that fought the Redcoats with George Washington. Saw the general the other day. Over there, the boys of 1812, the Indian fighters. Up there's regiment after regiment of blues and grays. Back there on Manila Boulevard, there's some of Dewey's men. My outfit's billeted up here in the new sector. Reckon they'll be opening up some more sectors now. Plenty of room for all of you. For you boys from this war and from the next.
There isn't going to be any next.
Oh, where have I heard that before?
Yes, I know. It's been said since the Bible was in its first edition. But this time, we're going to make the
world safe for democracy.
The world safe, period. Safe for us to continue our democracy. Safe for any other nation who may choose to live under a democracy or any other book of rules, whatever its name. Just so long as they call a fair ball fair and a foul ball foul.
Who's going to do your umpiring?
Every nation. The bush leaguers and the majors alike. If and when they prove themselves able and worthy to rate being called a ball club.
I've heard all that before, too, buddy. And no reflection on you, it was said better by a great man that's up here with us now, Woodrow Wilson. And what happened? America decided they didn't want to play ball with the International League, so they left Wilson out there on third base and they walked off of the field. When he tried to tell them that they're a big league club now and that they no longer playing sandlot ball, they sold him and his hopes and his ideals down the river.
That was 1918, 500 years ago. This time you can bet your last Lincoln penny Uncle Sam's gonna be right in there, pitching.
You taking any bets? When the last shot's fired, they'll take all of the Roosevelt, the Wallace, the Hull, the Wells, the Wilkie speeches. They'll pack them away in mothballs. They'll climb up on the bleachers. They'll eat hot dogs. They'll watch the other clubs slug it out. 6 will get you 12. That 15 or 20 years from now, they'll be opening up new sectors in here.
Better cut down on the odds, soldier. Because when this ball game is over, a lot of guys are going to be struck out, that's true. But a lot of guys are going to be coming back to home plate. And they're going to ask a lot of questions. And they're going to have a lot to say about who does what and when. A whole flack of contracts and promissory notes is being dished out to them. And they're coming back to collect. My money's on them. And on the Roosevelts, the Churchills, the Stallions, and the Chiang Kai-sheks. I'm putting my dough on a ball slugger called reason. On a pitcher called common sense. On an outfield called decency. Faith. Brotherhood. Religion. Teams like that are warming up all over the globe. They're in spring training now. But when the season starts, they're going to be all out there slugging, pitching, fielding their way to a World Series pennant called peace.
Yes, all over the world. In Australia, Belgium, Brazil, Canada, China, Costa Rica, Cuba, Czechoslovakia, the Dominican Republic, the Free Danish movement, England, Ethiopia, the Fighting Free French, Greece, Guatemala, Haiti.
Gosh, David, that seems like a long time ago in a galaxy far, far away.
Elaborate, please.
Just that sense of group identity, that we're connected back to the revolution. The idea that we're going to stop war. That's just not the way we think today.
How about the generations that you saw there? Any comments on that? Nobody thought about that?
Well, we couldn't really see the video very well, unfortunately, but I gather that the veteran from 1918 would have been lost.
He would have, yeah.
Yeah. And I guess he was maybe expressing a little bit of disappointment. I liked how it was comparing war to baseball, as though that was sort of like, those were the terms that the audience would be able to understand. So before we bagged on the game and we didn't follow through, and this time we're going to...
Left poor Wilson out on third base. Right.
Stick it out to the end.
Baseball metaphors were very popular in almost any context in those days. Yeah. Yeah,
But
he's a
amount
cynical
of
lost who
detail in
doesn't
those
believe
analogies
it.
too. It's
Sorry?
not just. I was just saying that the amount of detail in those analogies. It's not just hitting a home run. I mean, everyone today knows a home run, but leaving a guy on base and this and that. I mean, that's I don't think the general public knows those kinds of baseball terms as well today.
Yeah.
No, they don't. That's true. But it was by so much the biggest sport. I mean, it was really nothing else. It was really the national pastime. It was what baseball was in the Dominican Republic for that. Yeah, Janie. Yes, Janie.
Who wrote the script for that? Who produced that?
I think it was produced by the War Department.
Yeah, it felt like a propaganda.
And it was directed by John Ford.
Yeah.
There's a wonderful Netflix series about this now, about 4 or 5 great directors who went to work doing this. Ford, William Wyler, George Stevens, Frank Capra, all went to work for the War Department doing this, and he was one of them. And Ford was a midwife also. Yeah.
Is that the Five Came Back
Yes.
series?
Five. That's right. Five Came Back. That's right. Yeah.
There was a book called Five Came Back, and it was about those directors.
That's right. But it is a Netflix series now. Yeah. Yes, it's very idealistic, and this is what they have been taught. And I did not mention, I should have, that in August 1941, so before we're in the war, Roosevelt met Churchill on warships off of Newfoundland, and they issued the Atlantic Charter. And first of all, it referred to the destruction of Nazi tyranny. In other words, they're determined to defeat Nazi Germany even before we're in the war. And it blessed the idea of a new world organization, which Churchill didn't want to do. And they're obviously talking about that as well. But yes, they really believe they can make it happen. And the Atlantic Charter also said, this is another echo of it in the video, we recognize the right of all people to choose the form of government under which they should live. In other words, we're not saying democracy for everybody. Anybody can do what they want, but they have to live in peace. So yes, they were on the way for that. And James is right. We certainly don't have that today. And later in the course, we'll try to get into why we don't have that today. And actually, I hope to look in some detail at what went wrong and when, because I think it began quite a while ago. Apparently, though, it was inevitable, but I'm getting ahead of myself now. So let's go to Mr. Roberts, and let's begin as we customarily do. What generations do we see?
GI, Lost, and Missionary.
Yeah.
Who's a missionary?
The old Doc.
Yeah.
Oh, I've never thought that. I've always assumed he was a lost, like the actor playing in William Powell.
I kind of assumed, given the age that he was given and the kind of like the kind of paternal easygoingness which other missionary characters in film of that time seem to have been given as a kind of aura about them, that he could have been like a late-end missionary.
Well, you're right. I mean, all he has to be is 62 or 63. It's possible.
And there was just too much similarity with the way George Bailey's father expresses himself, the similarity between other sort of similar missionary characters that I've seen portrayed on film, that kind of laid back, well, you don't need to rush into things. No. You don't need to get yourself killed. Don't need to get yourself killed. Kind of attitude.
Well, I don't know. On the other hand, he has a very takes a very hard-headed attitude in the big conversation when they're arguing about whether Doug's right to get into the war. And he's saying, everybody's good enough. It's just a question of being in the right place at the right time, etc. So that is an interesting idea. And he certainly does look like he could be 62 or 63 years old, which is all he has to be a missionary.
See, I thought he was lost because of all the references to alcohol, and that apparently in the play he was an alcoholic. And they
have read the play, and I don't remember that.
But he was the one always. Well, that was what I read, that they changed from the play to the screenplay. But anyway, that he was the one passing out alcohol to everybody. And that would be something more a lost would do than a missionary, I would think.
Well, maybe. The play is really very similar. They didn't change very much, but they had to change a lot of dialogue because of the strict limits on what kind of language you could use in the movie. in those days. And there's some very funny lines that got lost. But it's a pretty faithful adaptation on the whole. Okay, and who was the other loss in Mr. Roberts?
Mr. Roberts and the captain.
And Mr. Roberts, I think, is clearly a GI.
Cagney's character was.
Cagney, yes. Cagney is definitely a loss. Now.
Really? I thought that he might have been 50-ish, in which case he could have been late wave lost.
Yeah. No, who is? Cagney.
Yeah, I think that one of the problems in the movie is that Henry Fonda is like 50 years old, but I think he's miscast age-wise.
That could be too.
That he was really a GI in real life and also a GI in the movie, but he was too old for the particular job he was given. He was miscast in that respect.
Yeah.
Well,
I agree.
I also kind of think that in a lot of the post-war films, that a lot of the GIs took on the roles of, they just were playing themselves, and they weren't going to let any fresh-faced kid play them, kind of.
Well,
At least that's the kind of attitude that I've.
Fonda owned that role because he had played it on Broadway, and I don't think there was any possibility that anybody else would play it. I don't think any of the rest of the cast was also in the Broadway cast. Oh, I would have to look that up. Let's talk a little about the whole crew of GI leading men. Yes, Jocelyn, I agree. Pulver is a GI, although Jack Lemmon actually is a first wave silent, born in 1925. And I'm pretty certain that Jack Lemmon in real life did not get into combat. But he's playing a GI, definitely. He's been to college already. And he's a GI who hasn't grown up yet, as they make clear every time. Okay, in addition to Fonda, we have, let's see, John Wayne, Kirk Douglas, Gregory Peck, Montgomery Clift, I suppose. Let's see. Oh, Jimmy Stewart.
Gone, David.
What? Hello? Everything all right? Hello?
You're cutting in and out.
Oh, well, I guess we're having some connectivity problems, but we've got connectivity. How am I now? Hello?
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 Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Good. You can hear me now. Hello? I can, yes, okay, good. Okay, John Wayne, Kirk Douglas, Burt Lancaster, Fonda. Do you see any commonalities in that group and what they project about what being a man is? Yes, Jocelyn. Thank you. Feel free to speak.
They're all very forthright, and they don't hold back about their attempts at heroism.
Yes, right.
I mean, they stand up and take charge and not afraid of danger.
Yep.
They also stick up for what's right. They have like a code of conduct that they have to support virtue.
Right. Okay.
Even to the point of risking your career. Like Mr. Roberts would rather not advance in his career if advancing in his career means doing anything dishonest.
Yep. Susan, you had your hand up?
Well, no, that's pretty much what I was going to say. But I do think, though, that in this particular film, I don't get the sense that being a hero was really what Henry Fonda was trying to do. I mean, this film, this is not about doing anything, being in a dangerous situation and leading men forward. It's not a dangerous situation, but in the sense that they're not about to be killed or, you know, having to dig themselves out of a camp or something. But Cagney definitely is the, you know, he's the evil force there, and Fonda is the, you know, the opposing leader of the to that, you know, leader in opposition to that force, leading the crew, who all seem to know what the right way to behave is. So
Yes, hang on a sec, because I want to draw Susan out a little more. Okay, I don't disagree with what you're saying, but Fonda thinks what he wants more than anything else is to be
is to be a hero, right?
But you seem to think that something else is actually more important to him, and what is it?
Well, in the end, I mean, it's a little ambiguous, I think. He's struggling with he comes to recognize that his role with these guys on the ship is probably the most important thing in life, that the friendships and the bonds and so on are more important than, you know, going off and being on a battleship. But yet you know, he goes and he's still, you know, he doesn't say, okay, I'm going to stay.
Right.
He leaves. So no, that's true. But you don't, though that's there, you see, you know, and he's trying every day or every week to get reassigned. His general demeanor, it's not like Cagney's, who's just, no matter what, he's striving to become, you know, the next, get up the next few rungs of the ladder. In contrast, Henry Fonda isn't trying to climb a ladder. He's trying to be, you know, he's trying to be a good soldier or a good, you know, a good man in the military. And that has different, you know, he struggles with what that actually means. In the end, he struggles with it.
Okay, Chad.
A stronger sense of group mentality, and by that I mean what benefits the group the most people overall, compared to what is best for me. And that's obviously played up really strong between the conflict between Mr. Rogers and the captain.
Yes. And again, the emphasis on the group and what's good for the crew is also the principle for which we are supposed to be fighting the war, if you listen to FDR.
Mm-hmm.
That this is to make a better life possible for everybody. So there really is a very distinct link. And a lot of what has just been said comes out in the big confrontation between Mr. Roberts and the captain, when Mr. Roberts shouts at him, "How did you get on our side?" Which I think is one of the most powerful lines in the movie. What?
I couldn't hear you.
How did you get on our side? That line of Fonda is, to me, one of the most powerful ones in the movie. Yeah.
So what's the palm tree? What does the palm tree mean?
The palm tree is Cagney's pride for having distinguished himself as he sees it. Actually, this is one thing they did change from the play, and I don't know why they did it, because in the play it was funnier. In the last scene in the play, it's now 2 palm trees, not 1. And at the climax, Paul throws them both over the board. Which I thought was really, I don't know why they changed that, but they did. Yeah. I want to throw something else in because I don't want to forget it. The head nurse who Culver is making the play for, like Peggy in They Made Me a Criminal, is a good portrait of a genuine GI woman who obviously has plenty of street smarts and who isn't going to be fooled by Culver. On the other hand, the younger nurses whom he runs into when he goes over to the hospital are obviously silenced and caricatures of silent womanhood. And I don't think that they're in the play. Yeah. Jane. Yes, Jane.
Yeah, so to me, the one that I had a hard time pegging was the Ward Bond character. So he was I guess, the chief petty officer.
Yes.
But was he lost or GI?
He could be either one. I'm pretty sure Ward Bond was actually a GI, but he looks pretty old. So he certainly could have been lost. Yes. In the same way that John Wayne, as the sergeant sends to Iwo Jima, which we're going to look at the very end, very briefly, is certainly a loss, in my opinion, in that movie. Now, it seems to me there's a very real parallel with They Made Me a Criminal, in that the crew is in a way a gang, and Fonda's role is actually quite similar to Garfield's role with them, as the leader and the person they come to all look up to and to count on. Yeah. And Fonda, again, is willing to humiliate himself totally for their sake. But he's really driven by concern for them. But again, and again, it's not that I know the answer and I'm daring you guys to guess it. I hope you figured out I don't teach that way. I learned not to do it a long time ago. I'm genuinely fascinated by this. Why do you think Fonda is so desperate to get into combat? Yes. Mike.
So this is actually something that bothered me as I was watching the movie. I thought this was really, I thought it was obscure. When I was thinking about some of the people either that I know from that generation or that I've read about, it's much more clear why they wanted to be in combat. Either, I wanted to get the war over, I thought I could do better. If I didn't do it better, somebody else was gonna, somebody else was gonna die. So that's one thing that I've heard some people say. Second thing I've heard is, honestly, since I've read some political biographies, some political people thought it would be advantageous for their careers to have been in combat. And I'm sure there were other things. I'm sure there were people who craved excitement as well. And yet, I was also thinking about people who were reluctant, to be in combat, and were more than happy to have, or would have been more than happy to have a different, different assignments. So I thought it was unclear in the movie, and I thought there was a little snippet of a line in which Fonda says, "I've been at sea for 29 months." So again, I was trying to read Fonda back into my preconceptions. There was a line where Fonda says, "I've been at sea for 29 months. I can do a good job," which sort of mapped back to one of my preconceptions. But frankly, I couldn't tell from the movie. And so I wonder if it's not a Rorschach blot for us to project, our own views of why people did that. Okay, I'll be quiet.
I felt like he was losing his idealism being under a captain who was so tyrannical. And he was really good working on that ship in the beginning. They talk about that, how good, that palm tree is for him. It wasn't for the captain. And as he watches this tyrannical captain take responsibility and ownership of everything he's done, he feels like if that's going to happen, he needs to go somewhere else. He says, "I need to get away from you." He keeps saying that through the whole film. It's not as much to get out there and be on those ships as it is to get away from this tyranny that he is in and go fight tyranny someplace else. He's so angry at the way this man is treating everybody on this ship. that he's really got to get out there and go do something to stop that. I feel like the captain is kind of our representation of the bad that we're out there fighting. And he doesn't feel like fighting the captain on this ship is working, and he needs to get out there and fight it for real and get his hands into it. That's what I sensed from the film.
Hence the line, how'd you end up on our side?
Right.
Yeah. I don't know. I suppose we're all, it is hard to say. And for me, to me, it looks like it's pure competitiveness in a lot of ways. And that he really wants to show that he can do the most difficult job and the most dangerous job. Eileen, what you said is very interesting. And I don't know, has anybody here ever read The Caine Mutiny? No, nobody here has ever read The Caine Mutiny. Wow. Not even Jane.
I've read it.
Oh, you have? Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Oh, no. Oh, I didn't
Yeah,
see you, Judy.
I've read
Right. Well, again, they're under a somewhat tyrannical captain. I'm not hearing you, Michael. Are you hearing me? Yeah.
Yeah, I was actually thinking about The Caine Mutiny, which has been a long time since I've read.
Okay.
For a very long time, as I was watching the movie, and wondering how we would compare, Fonda to the Princeton-educated lieutenant. Yeah.
Well, it comes up. Okay, that's a situation where they're under a tyrannical captain, and he does get relieved command in the middle of a typhoon. But later, the actual hero says, our mistake was that we transferred the hatred that we should have felt for the Japanese to him. They're not in combat either, by the way. They're in a somewhat similar kind of situation. Well, they are in combat a couple of times, but not much. So that's another angle to it. Yes, Jane.
Yeah, I was going to say that with the captain, and did we all agree that he's well lost? Yes?
Yes, definitely.
Yeah, okay, yeah, and that his goals were personal and cheap and non-heroic and selfish, so thinking of sort of F. Scott Fitzgerald, and where obviously Mr. Rogers was going for the real heroic. Right, I mean, Mr. Robert, the real heroic, and sort of going back to the Rosie the Riveter documentary again, sort of elevating the female chores of the kitchen to actually building battleships, but personal selfish goals elevated to the grand design of saving the world. So at any rate.
Okay. Now, we're getting down on time. I hope you won't mind staying just a couple of minutes late because there are a couple of things I want to do, but it won't take long. First of all, a personal note, I can't resist telling you. I saw this when it came out, when I was 8. My older brother had a friend visiting him, and we went to 2 movies, I remember. One was Strategic Air Command with Jimmy Stewart, which sticks in my head because they fly a B-36 at one point, and I had built a model of a B-36 already. And the second was this. And I don't think I understood a lot of what was going on, but I had 3 vivid memories that stayed with me from this movie. The first was when Cagney goes to the safe and takes out the hat. That really made an impression on me for some reason. The second was the suds from the laundry coming down the aisle. And the third was the death of Mr. Roberts, which I did understand and was probably, I think, the most intense grief reaction I had had to anything up until that time. I mean, I didn't start crying, but I was really shocked and walked out of that theater a different man. And I do think, that was one of the things that happened to everybody who went to war. Was the people they survived. They knew people who had died, and it had a big effect on them. And we're going to see a lot of PTSD, I think, in GIs in weeks to come. But the last thing I want to show you is a little different. And it's a clip from Sands of Iwo Jima. And how many people have seen Sands of Iwo Jima? Not very many. Okay. This is about a Marine battalion, a Marine company, platoon, I guess. And John Wayne is their sergeant. And the other real protagonist is a clean-cut young GI whose father was a friend of John Wayne, actually, in the Army, named Conway. And this is in the late stages of the war. And the scene we're going to look at is either in late 1944 or 45. And they've been training in Australia, and Conway, in a familiar plot line, has fallen in love with an Australian girl and gotten married. And now she has had a kid. And in this scene, they are celebrating the kid. So let me get this going. Okay, man.
Baby's a big event.
Conway. Treating the boys, huh?
We'll crack open the hatch.
That's great. Fella always gets more kick out of a boy, I guess. I got a kid, you know. Sam, I named him. After your old man. Wait till he gets to be 10 and doesn't write you. He'll be mad enough to put welts on him.
No, I won't, Stryker. Because he won't have to write. I'll be where he is. And I won't insist that he be tough. Instead, I'll try to make him intelligent. And I won't insist that he read the Marine Corps manual. Instead, I'll get him a set of Shakespeare. In short, I don't want him to be a Colonel Sam Conway or a Sergeant John Stryker. I want him to be intelligent, considerate, cultured, and a gentleman.
Ladies and gentlemen, you have just been introduced to the boom generation. Yes, Tamara. Tamara?
Oh, no, I just was trying to get back.
Oh, okay. Yeah. That's our first boomer. We see him off screen.
Right.
But there will be more. Any last words?
Well, I would say that in Mr. Roberts, that class struggle is happening too. The manly man versus culture and class is the kind of a big discussion. The captain's the manly street man, and Mr. Roberts is the educated man who wants to love the people of the street, but also keep his ideals high. I think that kind of is what was the overriding takeaway for me in watching the film. Was that kind of class struggle.
Well,
yes, that is a definite element in it, yes.
Yeah.
Susan?
Well, one of the things that really struck me in this one and also in They Made Me a Criminal was the tenderness and sweetness of both of those men. And that's, the sort of stereotype of hero. I mean, I wouldn't have thought that would be part of what was considered heroic in those times, but it seemed to me to be a really important part of both of their characters.
Well, let me say, this is something I've noticed. When you have a single-sex environment, our tendency is to think that the stereotypical characteristics of that gender is all you're going to see. In fact, it works out to be the exact opposite, that people will step forward to supply what's missing because there are no men there or no women there. And you see that in the traditional military all the time. And I see a few people nodding. Yes, Susan.
I guess just one observation that occurred to me is that we haven't really talked about is the way in which Mr. Roberts dies is so unheroic. So that in a way the message really is that heroism has nothing to do with being on a battleship or being supposedly being headed toward the front lines, because he dies this really absurd death, having coffee. while having coffee, you know, and what are they, I think they get torpedoed. I can't remember, but by a
The
jet.
kamikaze.
They get hit by a kamikaze. That is very true to life.
That's
Yeah.
right. It was a suicide plane.
Yes, and at Okinawa, we lost a number of ships to kamikaze.
Right. And there's something very poignant and sort of something that leaves you thinking. I feel about the film, and I found the film interesting in the mix of the comedic with the really, you know, more thoughtful kind of issues that were being addressed. Thought-provoking, I should say.
It presaged, I mean, it prefigured, I guess. Same thing happened in MASH, what came out in the 1970s, where the admired, beloved colonel left the show and was killed.
Yeah.
You know, one thing I haven't heard anyone say is, to the extent that guilt or shame would be involved when you're in, we've never experienced a complete mobilization of our society like World War II. And the people who were involved in that would feel guilty if they were not giving their utmost. And Mr. Roberts, to me, filled the GI role to the T, because it was really a matter of shame or guilt, whatever word you want to use, that he had to go to a place where he felt like he was giving everything he had to give and not wasting his time with this captain who bordered on madness.
Okay, well, thanks very much.
Thank you.
I'm just going to try to pick
Thank
up a
you, David.
microphone, which may help some. No, not at all. And next week, okay, An Apartment for Peggy, I'll post it. It's also available free at that same archive site. The other movie that I could have used for next week is The Best Years of Our Lives, which is wonderful.
Oh, yeah.
But
What is it?
but a lot of people have seen that, and nobody's ever seen An Apartment for Peggy, probably. And it is also.
But you can see the
extraordinary movie.
best years of our lives over and over again.
Yes, you can. That's true. But you'll enjoy this too, believe me. And also,
Okay.
it's going to make a beautiful link up with another movie that we have coming down the road.
Thank you.
So, thanks again. Great to see you all.
Okay. See you next week.
See you next week.